the chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai, and Jesse Blumenthal from the Koch Institute. Thank you both.
All right. Hey, how are you?
Good. Thanks very much.
Great.
Thanks, sir.
Take it from here.
Hey, thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you.
You wanted to, say a few things before we get started, have some thoughts on sort of technology and telecommunications, and I'm going to let you sort of tee up the conversation, then I've definitely got some follow-up questions for you.
Sure, and I was describing to Jesse behind the scenes, it's going to be about a 60-minute speech on the intricacies of telephone regulation going back to 1934. If you guys have time, I don't know if you've had lunch already, but we see the telephone caucus in the back. That's great. So, but before I begin, I do have a confession to make. My main preparation for this event was unsuccessfully trying to figure out how to bypass the 3-hour line for barbecue at Franklin's. But the most disappointing thing isn't that I didn't get the barbecue, it's that I actually spent 3 hours trying to figure this out. But I did hit a food truck on the way here. But more seriously, thank you so much to Erick Erickson, to the entire team at Resurgent for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. It's something that I've been very excited about over the last couple of months as it's coming together, and it is fantastic to be here in Texas. It's even better to be out of Washington. Those are not necessarily the same things. But certainly look forward to talking to Jesse about topics like 5G and free speech and the like. But I thought I'd spend a few minutes just sort of sketching out where I come from on these issues and why I think it matters and why it should matter to you. My sort of guiding philosophy, as it were, at the FCC. I've been at the FCC now since 2012, believe it or not. I spent 4.5 years as a commissioner, and over the last 18 months, having fallen through the cracks in January 2017, I have been serving as its chairman. And I've had a front row seat over the last couple of decades since I've been working in the communications field on one of the most incredible free market success stories in history. This little thing called the internet, which you might have heard of. Now, the key to this success story, to me at least, is that American policymakers 20 years ago stood at a crossroads. They had a very fundamental choice to make. Are we going to treat this new thing, this dynamic sector called the internet, we're going to treat it like a water company or an electric company, a slow-moving utility, or are we going to let the free market reign? And to their credit, President Clinton and a Republican Congress decided we are going to take a forward-looking view on how to regulate this. We're not going to look to the tired old doctrines of the past. Anyone, anywhere, would be allowed, henceforth, in the mid-1990s, to introduce a new product, a new service, without having to ask for permission from the government. This is a pretty radical thing for something as large as the internet promised to be at the time. This concept of permissionless innovation, I think, is essential to the growth of technological innovation. It's what allows an entrepreneur to take an idea and to run with it as far as he or she wants to take it. The economist Adam Thierer, who I'm sure is familiar to some of you, explained the concept best. He called it, and I quote, "The notion that experimentation with new technologies and business models should generally be permitted by default." And I like that view. To me, it seems like the free market, not bureaucrats, should be the one picking winners and losers. In the absence of this heavy-handed regulation that the prior administrations decided to forego, the results spoke for themselves. We saw $1.5 trillion, with a T, dollars of network investment. We saw small startups go from garages and bedrooms into global giants. And we saw consumers benefiting from all of this innovation in ways that were unthinkable just a generation ago. I mean, for someone like me who grew up in rural Kansas in the 70s and 80s, at a time when it was 3 broadcast channels, a big telephone wired into the wall, and the local paper, the Parsons Sun, it's unthinkable to see how my kids interact with technology and use it in ways that, as I said, were inconceivable not long ago. And I think the fact that some of the digital companies have succeeded as much as they have and are participating in this conference speaks to the vital role that free markets have played, not just in their success, but in the success of the overall internet economy. Now, given this record, one might think that Americans would be brimming with optimism about the future of digital technology. But the reality is that we're now seeing more skepticism than ever before about some of the impact of these technologies. And part of the anxiety, I think, flows from worries about how these technologies are changing the nature of work. Here's a recent story. A team of 15 radiologists recently competed against an artificial intelligence system to see who could diagnose neurological disorders faster and more accurately. And this is mind-blowing. Each side studied 225 samples. The team of humans took an average of 30 minutes to diagnose a patient with a 66% accuracy rate. The artificial intelligence system, just a series of algorithms, made a correct diagnosis 87% of the time in only 15 minutes. Now, medical school graduates have cause to feel threatened by digital innovation, and they're not alone. Many workers without college degrees, for example, who represent 70% of American adults, are thinking the same thing, whether they're in long-haul trucking or another profession. And make no mistake, there are legitimate questions about the impact of these technologies on the workforce. Now, I bring up this issue to explain why it is sometimes hard for government to be on the side of innovation. But before change occurs, it's often easier to identify and focus on those who will be hurt rather than those who will be helped, even if in the long run, far more people will be helped. We saw this with the introduction of the automobile, with the light bulb, with other innovations. Or to paraphrase the French economist Frédéric Bastiat, policymakers have a destructive habit on focusing on that which is seen without acknowledging that which is not seen. And perhaps the best example of this dynamic can be found at the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which is now headed by my good friend and the brilliant Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Now, the FDA's job, of course, is to keep us safe, while at the same time giving the green light to potentially life-saving drugs. And these responsibilities require a difficult balancing act, but incentives often place a thumb on the scale against innovation. Because if you think about it, if you approve a drug that can't be 100% guaranteed to be safe, there is a risk, however slight, that people will get hurt. And then you will be vilified in the press, you'll be dragged in front of Congress for hearings, your professional reputation will be ruined, you might even get some harsh tweets. Now, if FDA reviewers refuse to approve a beneficial drug, however, few people are ever going to know about it. I mean, how many people are going to read stories about the FDA drugs that were stuck in the pipeline, that didn't go anywhere? In fact, the numerous lives that could have been improved or even saved are unlikely even to be acknowledged by the public. And so returning to the topic of digital technologies, there are some legitimate downsides that we can clearly see. But I don't think we should use that as an excuse to not look at the benefits that could happen if we introduce these new technologies. And so instead of viewing innovation as a problem to be regulated based on rules from the past, I think the government should view innovation's potential, guided by markets that embrace the future. In my view, government can best serve the public interest, the American interest, through what I call regulatory humility. And this means not pretending that you, as a bureaucrat, have every answer to every problem. Instead, it means making an honest assessment of where the market is, recognizing the government can't always predict where it's going to go, and that it shouldn't try to micromanage the future, and instead should just try to get rid of the red tape that stifles innovation and investment, and let the market, guided by basic principles of competition law, sort it out. Now, what kind of red tape are we talking about when it comes to the FCC? Well, my time here is limited, but I'll just give you one quick example of some of the things that I deal with on a daily basis. You probably recognize that the world of communications is going digital. The technologies of the future are based on something called the Internet Protocol, or IP. But I inherited rules at the FCC that essentially demanded that for a whole bunch of companies maintain the fading copper networks that have been in the ground, in some cases, for 100 years, instead of investing in next-generation technologies like fiber or other IP-based technologies. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but it does come at a serious cost to consumers, especially those in rural areas and in hard-to-serve areas. By definition, every dollar that a company has to spend propping up a fading technology cannot be spent building the networks of the future. And that's why we voted under my leadership to get rid of these perverse rules, to try to free up investment that could be focused on connecting people with the best and brightest technologies. Now, perhaps the best example of the benefits when the FCC just steps out of the way and lets market forces and innovation work came back in the 1980s. I wasn't at the FCC at the time, but some of my predecessors, Chairman Mark Fowler and Chairman Dennis Patrick under the Reagan administration, were pioneers of this same philosophy. And back then, there were some airwaves that were commonly called junk airwaves. No one thought that this spectrum could be usable for anything. So they said, okay, let's just set it aside, essentially as a playpen for entrepreneurs, and see what happens. And we called it unlicensed spectrum. You didn't have to come to the FCC and get a permission slip to be able to use these airwaves. Anyone can use it, basically, so long as you're not causing interference to other people in other bands. Now, at first, the applications were things that are now commonplace: garage door openers, baby monitors, and the like. But the real breakthroughs came through a little bit later, when folks recognized its potential, and engineers decided, well, why don't we make something called Bluetooth, or even more significantly, Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is a great example of the government getting out of the way, letting market forces work, and letting technologists and engineers, instead of bureaucrats in Washington, decide how to best use this public resource. And today, of course, as you probably know, Wi-Fi is so popular that it drives everything from the hotels that people check into, to the first thing they do at home, to it helps save countless audience members from having to listen to boring speakers like me at conferences like this. It's one of the most popular applications that we have. And these breakthroughs were not the result of government micromanagement. And so here's the bottom line from my perspective. Whenever a technological innovation creates uncertainty, some will always have the knee-jerk reaction to say that it's going to be bad. They'll demand that we do whatever is necessary to preserve the status quo. They will try to strangle it with a study or a commission. They will bemoan those who are supposedly being left behind. They will stipulate that nothing can be done unless it can be done with absolute certainty. They will try to regulate these new services through the paradigms of old, no matter how old and tired they are. They will always find a way to say no. But I'm not in the business of saying no as a knee-jerk reaction. I think we should resist that temptation. Guilty until proven innocent is not a recipe for consumers to be better off in the long run. And it is not a recipe for innovation. I mean, history tells us that it is not preemptive regulation, but permissionless innovation that ultimately makes us all much better off. I think a future that's enabled by the next generation of technology can be bright if only we decide to let the light in, so to speak. So that's a sort of a brief sketch of where I'm coming from on technological issues, on how I approach my job at the FCC, and I very much look forward to an interesting conversation with Jesse and with all of you in the time to come. Thanks.
So first of all, thank you for those remarks, for being here. I really want to dive in right to the heart of your speech. So yeah. I think you just gave a very impassioned plea for permissionless innovation and for regulatory humility. And that works really well when there are regulators who embrace that as their mandate. But as you pointed out, there's a lot of incentives to want to give people something, a program, spending, regulation, a carve-out, something to allay those fears. So I guess where I'd like to begin is when you are talking to members of Congress, like the folks who have been here throughout the conference, when you're talking to fellow regulators at different three-letter agencies, how do you convince them to start from a position of regulatory humility? What's your sort of case to them as a peer?
It's not an easy case, to be sure. As I often say, borrowing from Shakespeare, hell hath no fury like a regulator bored. I think quite often people just see a marketplace and they think, we have to have our finger in that pie. It could be for illicit reasons. We just want our regulatory rents to be extracted. It could be for positive reasons. They really do believe that, okay, the government has to regulate this, otherwise consumers are going to be left to the mercy of market forces. But what I try to suggest in forums like this, when I talk to my colleagues at other agencies, when I speak to members of Congress, like Congressman Davidson, who's a very forward-thinking elected official who you'll hear from soon, is that consumers are ultimately better off when the government sets broad terms for competition to allow everyone to be able to compete on a level playing field, and then lets the market take over. I mean, a great example is Ronald Coase, the famed economist, who in 1959 wrote a paper called The Federal Communications Commission. Not a very exciting title, but the idea within the paper was profound. He said, instead of having these unelected bureaucrats in Washington have what are called beauty contests, where people would come in and literally say, I want to be able to get a license for this slice of spectrum. Here's how I'm going to use it. Don't make me pay anything for it, but I'm just better than all the other folks. You should give it to me. That was a recipe, if not for corruption, for at least the kind of cronyism that didn't really benefit anybody. So Coase said, why don't we just have an open auction where anyone can pony up money to bid for these licenses? For almost 40 years, he was laughed out of the room. In fact, some of my predecessors at the commission said, this is a ridiculous idea. This has as much chance of succeeding as, quote, the Easter Bunny at the Preakness. But now, spectrum auctions are commonly seen as the most viable way to do things. It's produced tens of billions of dollars of benefit for the Treasury. It's gotten so much more commercial spectrum out there for consumers to use. And ultimately, it takes the decision-making power out of the hands of bureaucrats like me and puts its faith in the market. And ultimately, everyone is better off. I mean, the wireless industry has thrived precisely at the time when we've been auctioning off this spectrum, as opposed to doling it out to all our friends in the audience. And so that's part of the philosophy I try to explain is that it's not easy to say that the government should have a more light touch approach to things, but at the end of the day, if you look at long-term value across of these industries, not just telecom, you'll see that consumers are indeed better off. And Scott Gottlieb, who I mentioned, is taking a very forward-looking view of this as well. If you look at some of his work, he said, look, we want to be able to encourage some of these new drugs. We don't want to strangle them in their infancy through round after round of study because we're risk averse about the potential negative downside of a 0.001% risk. That's the kind of forward-thinking approach we need to have from our regulators and from folks in Congress.
So I'd like to then ask you about a particular type of sort of forward-leaning technology that's on the horizon. One of the things that folks are doing with this newly liberated spectrum and with the capital they're able to invest. So I'm sure folks in the audience have heard about 5G. 5G's coming. I know that when I look at my iPhone and it says I've got 4G LTE, that means it works. And when it doesn't say LTE, it means it works less well. And if it says anything below 4, I start to get nervous. So what is 5G? How much should we care about it? What does it mean to go from 4 to 5?
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about 5G at the FCC, and part of the reason why is because it promises an incredible improvement in wireless services that we all use. I think, as you said, most of us are familiar with 4G or the lack thereof of it. As I said, I come from a small town in Kansas that sometimes is stuck, not getting any Gs, and that's not acceptable either. But 5G promises 100 to 1,000 times the speed of wireless services. It also uses different kinds of spectrum and has a different kind of network, a whole bunch of small cells instead of a big 200-foot cell tower. And the end result for the consumer is tremendously fast, tremendously resilient services. So imagine, if you will, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, being able to have a virtual visit with your doctor, super high resolution experience where your doctor is able to diagnose in real time some of your vital signs. If you've got a lesion on your skin, he can view that with precision and provide a diagnosis on the spot. That's one of the high bandwidth applications, as we call it, are things like virtual reality and augmented reality. Now it still blows my mind that we're thinking about these things, but in the future it's not inconceivable that we might be able to learn in a virtual environment where my kids or perhaps my grandkids will be able to visit the pyramids in Egypt in essentially a real environment using some of this 5G technology. And there are even more mundane applications too. For example, if you're a yogurt manufacturer and you need to ship yogurt across the country in trucks, and the temperature of the truck can't go above a certain temperature, to be able to have a small sensor that uses 5G spectrum to communicate in a very low bandwidth way. It's sending very little information back to the network, but just saying, okay, the truck is a certain temperature, we're fine. That could really improve productivity. And I often use the example of agriculture, coming from an agricultural state, and for those of you who are, you'll probably appreciate this. In the last few months alone, I've been in a corn farm in Charles City, Virginia, a potato farm in King Hill, Idaho, a feedlot in Allen, Kansas, and I've seen the potential of some of this technology. This notion that agriculture and technology are two different things is entirely wrong. The 21st century American farm is incredibly competitive because they're using technology in innovative ways to figure out, almost by the square foot, which part of the field needs fertilizer and which doesn't, which needs water and which doesn't. Using drones, for example, to monitor in real time where pests are starting to infest a part of the field and that kind of thing. 5G has a potential application in rural areas that we're just scratching the surface of. And that's before we talk about all the other technologies that could be based on 5G, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and the like.
So I think when we start talking about classrooms of the future based on virtual reality, folks start to think that sounds pretty far off. But some of the applications you're talking about are fairly near. So I know the FCC this week also started a process around telemedicine that your colleague Brendan Carr has been working on, particularly looking at telemedicine to low-income folks or folks who don't live in major urban areas, don't have access to the type of connectivity networks that, quite frankly, a lot of folks who live in cities take for granted. And so when you think about sort of the role of the FCC or other regulatory bodies in creating a policy environment that makes that possible. How close are we to sort of broad scale deployment of telemedicine? What are the major barriers that you're looking at, even in the next year or couple of years, to address?
Yeah, this is a question that's near and dear to my heart. So as I said, I grew up in rural Kansas, the son of 2 rural physicians. And I remember when I was growing up, it was not uncommon for my father to leave, sometimes before dawn, to drive an hour west to see patients in a small town where otherwise they would never get to see a specialist like him. The next day he might drive 40 minutes north to see another town because he was pretty much the only urologist in southeast Kansas who was available to see patients. He was lucky to be able to do that, but now in the 21st century, we're finding it increasingly difficult to attract specialists to some of these towns. In fact, he just recently retired many years after he wanted to because they couldn't find anyone to replace him. And that's one of the things that really bothers me, is that there are millions of rural Americans in particular who might not get the health care that they need simply because they live in the wrong part of the United States. And that's simply not acceptable to me. And so one of the ways that I can try to ameliorate this situation, much to my parents' chagrin, I haven't gone to medical school, I think, but I think my parents still hold out hope. Maybe after this FCC thing, he can become a doctor. But anyway, barring that, the very least I can do is try to improve the FCC's policies on telemedicine, sort of play doctor, so to speak. But so we do have a rural healthcare program that essentially allows healthcare providers to get high-speed internet access and other technological services to allow them to do telemedicine. And I've seen the power of this. I cannot tell you what it means to look in the face of Gordon, who's a Vietnam veteran who I met in Lecanto, Florida, at a Veterans Affairs facility, and to see what it means to him to be able to get consultations from the best specialists at the University of Pittsburgh, over 1,000 miles away. Visited another facility in Boise, Idaho, where I met a man who had some PTSD issues, and to be able to get a mental health consultation from afar using telemedicine was tremendous. And that's just a few anecdotes from a few parts of the country. Multiply that out across the country, and you can see what the power of telemedicine can be. The biggest barrier right now is that we just don't have enough broadband, enough high-speed internet access out there. And I hear this a lot, both from people in urban areas and people in rural areas, that they don't have internet access at all, or they don't have access at the speeds that are necessary to support telemedicine. So we're trying to promote a lot more high-speed networks, and we can talk a lot about how we're modernizing our regulations to make it easier for telephone companies and cable companies and wireless companies and satellite companies and others to build these high-speed networks. In addition to that, Congress has told us to implement what's called the Universal Service Fund, essentially a subsidy program to subsidize the construction of these networks. Under my leadership, we've reformed it in a more market-friendly way to target unserved areas and to make sure that there's accountability on the back end, so that when we cut a check essentially to these companies, they will use those funds to build out these networks. So we're trying to address the number one problem, which is getting broadband into unserved parts of the country, and to make sure that telemedicine is a critical part of that. So
I think that actually raises a broader point, right? As I think about the role of the FCC, and I'm sure you've spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have, you're fundamentally in the speech business, right? So
I blather a lot, if that's what you're saying. Yeah.
So, a lot of the folks, whether it's through broadband communications, whether it's through sort of using wireless, whether they're regulated companies or not, a lot of this is about connecting people to other people or people to information. And so that to my mind raises broader sort of free speech and First Amendment questions when you talk about sort of the government being in the speech facilitation business. And so I'd like to ask you maybe a couple of questions about free speech, because it's come up throughout the morning and the afternoon so far. The first one is how do you think about your role in that process, right? So you're a government employee, you chair a government agency that is fundamentally in this sort of speech industry. And so what is the appropriate role of the FCC, and how do the sort of, what values guide that work?
I've long said that the First Amendment should undergird everything that our agency does. I think that the free speech protections that are enmeshed in the Constitution are arguably what defines this country. I mean, free speech as a constitutional protection is unusual among countries around the world and even in the West. And it's not easy to preserve, and that's part of the reason why I've consistently said from my earliest days of the commission, when I spoke out during the Obama administration against a plan to send government-funded researchers into the newsroom, asking them why they were covering some stories and not others, all the way until now, I've consistently defended free speech on the internet, is because I believe that the only way that American civil society can thrive, can continue to be the beacon for the rest of the world, is if we stand by this core constitutional freedom. And that's part of the reason why, I mean, not to be cheesy about it, but part of the reason why my parents came to this country and love this country. They recognize that this country is much more than a geographic area that's denoted on the map. It stands for a promise that anyone, regardless of who you are, should be able to speak your mind in an open democracy. That's a defining feature of our country, I think, and it's something I'm privileged and duty-bound, I think, to speak out about.
So the civil society piece of what you just raised, I think, is really important. This is something at the Charles Koch Institute and Charles Koch Foundation that we spend a lot of time thinking about. The way we comport ourselves in society, the way in which we engage with our fellow citizens, the way in which we talk to each other matters a lot. For folks who don't know you, you're very active on Twitter, and you're a great follow for all of you out there who aren't already following.
Ajit Pai FCC for those of you who are bored.
Ajit Pai FCC. But you've also experienced a lot of the potential downsides or the coarseness, the harshening threats. And so, yeah, I think you just gave a really impassioned sort of defense of free speech and American values, which is heartening to me. But having seen, quite frankly, some of the uglier sides of people using that ability to speak, I guess, how do you stay optimistic? Are you still optimistic about our speech values?
I'm optimistic about the values themselves. I will be candid, I'm not so optimistic about the culture of free speech in this country. And what I mean by that is that it's one thing to say on the cold parchment of the Constitution, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I think we all agree it's there, courts have protected it. As a legal principle, I think it's firmly in place. The culture is something I do worry about, though. I see that very few people nowadays seem willing to be able to live up to the doctrine that I think was misattributed to Voltaire, that I might disagree with what you say, but I will fight for your right to say it. And especially when it comes to the internet, I think we see a lot of voices that are more than happy to shout down or even censor views that are dissimilar to their own. And I think that's especially dangerous. I mean, it's ironic because there's some of the same people that are demanding that our government regulate the internet heavily, like a utility, in the name of free speech. But in addition to that, I do worry that as people become more tribalistic almost in their political preferences, they just don't want to hear different points of view. To me, that's a great thing about America, is that not only do we disagree agreeably for the most part, but that we learn from each other. I mean, I don't pretend to have a monopoly on wisdom. I've learned a lot of things from Twitter, from other online sources that have changed my mind or just educated me about something. But I think now a lot of people seem to want to just say, I only want the internet to be this highly curated garden where I can only see the plants that I want to see. And they never are exposed to a different point of view. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have a conversation with somebody about some of the decisions we've made, just outlining the basic points that we addressed when we made our decisions. And they'll say to me, wow, I had no idea. All I read was something here on the internet about how you were destroying the internet, or it was sort of the top line 280 character tweets about how you're such a terrible person and all this. And I just wonder, is that the future of this country? I hope not. I really hope not. And the thing is, though, it's going to require a lot of people of goodwill, not just on my side of the aisle. I don't think it's a political issue. I think it's all Americans have to embrace this value. And it is something that is only going to be as vibrant as the people of an age in which they live, defending it.
Yeah, no, that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, right? So when stuff goes wrong with this technology, and stuff goes wrong with technology, who do we want to blame, right? Do we want to blame the people who are doing bad things or the tools they use? And I think when we think about this, in the context of our work, we think about the responsibility lying with the people who do the bad actions, right? So if someone is harassing people on Twitter or making threats or just behaving rudely, that the responsibility lies with the person sort of behind the keyboard. It's not the keyboard's fault that you're a jerk on the internet. And so how do we heal? How do we move beyond that? Because I think there's a sort of general anxiety about the sort of coarsening or harshness of the discourse. But what can we do about it?
I don't pretend to have an answer. I will say I gave a speech last November 2017, where I talked about the impact of social media on American society. And if you're starved for some light evening reading material, I would encourage you to pick it up. But the essential thesis was, is social media good overall for American society? And I wasn't sure at the time, and I'm even more skeptical now. And I'll just give you two of the core arguments I made in that speech. Number one, I said that being at a distance from somebody when you're conversing with them on Twitter or Facebook or whatever allows you to be a lot harsher than you otherwise would be. I think very few Americans, especially younger Americans now, are accustomed to debating something, discussing something, arguing about something when they're face to face. There's something about that in-person communication when you look someone in the eye and say, I think you're wrong and here's why, that moderates the way in which you approach an issue. The second thing is the anonymity of it. I mean, I'm not saying that everyone on the internet should, obviously post under their actual identity, but I will say the anonymity of it does give people almost a carte blanche to say and act in ways that they never would act in real life. I've certainly been the recipient of a lot of that, and even aside from the illegal stuff that I have seen, just some of the things that you would see from people, you just can't imagine they would act like that if they would see you in person. And I think that overall effect does have a coarsening effect on our culture. It has some great effects too. Yeah, I've been able to meet people on the through Twitter and whatnot that I never would have had a chance to meet, learn things I wouldn't have had a chance to learn. But I do think there is a downside, and we would all do better, I think, to sometimes put down the phone and look at each other and talk about things in a more civil way. And especially for those who advocate things that aren't easily digestible in 280-character chunks, the value of free markets, the importance of free speech, constitutional liberty in the 21st century, these are things you're never going to be able to discuss or persuade anyone about on a simple post. It requires that ongoing conversation that I think in a lot of times the internet just does not allow.
Okay, so in that spirit, I want to challenge you on something you
Sure.
just said, right? So, first of all,
I work for the government, just so you know.
yeah,
So.
Well, that's never been a threat before. So I agree with you a lot about the civility,
you're on a
about
roll.
the
All right,
engagement,
this is
right? But there's a sort of tension in one of the things
Yeah.
you talked about, right? That a lot of folks, especially folks who are sort of ardent free speech supporters, will tend to take the position that more speech is better, right? That the solution to bad speech isn't suppressing it or constraining speech or less speech, but it's in fact greater speech, counter speech. It's people actively participating, and so. One of the things that I worry about in the context of this conversation is actually where you began with your remarks around the cultural fears, right? So if we demonize social places, if we demonize the technologies that allow us to communicate, right? The Facebooks and Twitters and other sort of social media companies in the world, if we make those places the target of our anger, then the sort of people who want to interact in a virtuous way retreat from those spaces, right? So if we give up on that as a forum for speech, as opposed to engaging it and using it in a positive way, then we really risk some of the not necessarily legal rights, but the cultural value that comes from free speech. And so, you still remain on Twitter and are actively engaged on Twitter.
Yeah.
And so when you think about this, is this, I understand the take a step back, engage with people in real life. It's rather pleasant.
It is.
But is there not an argument for engaging more online as a result?
Oh, absolutely. And what I would say is I'm not demonizing the platforms themselves, and I'm not demonizing the companies by any means. Obviously, my primary concern is that these platforms, certain people who engage in them aren't engaging in them in the sort of tradition of American debate with openness and transparency and civility and the like. I think it's more the way the platforms are used that I have a greater concern about. So it's more of a lament about the platforms as opposed to an attack on them as such. But that's one of the things that does worry me, though, over time, is that as you point out, I'm very active on Twitter. I learn from it a lot, but I do see that a lot of people are using that almost as a substitute for debate. And in fact, just today, as you might have seen on my Twitter feed, for the first time in Britain, well, I believe this is the case, people are using phones not for voice so much as for surfing on the internet and the like. And so that's a very interesting trend, but I think it shows that people are gravitating to these online platforms in some cases in lieu of in-person conversations. And that's just something as a citizen that worries me over time.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And you're not just some guy on Twitter. You're a guy from the government on Twitter, as you raised. And that actually introduces an interesting element into this, right? So there are a lot of folks who have called for, including people who may or may not be speaking at this conference, a fairness doctrine for the internet, for the government to impose neutrality, to make them make opinions be equal. The fairness doctrine used to be a thing that existed at the FCC, and so I'm wondering, given the sort of post-fairness doctrine evolution of broadcast media and the sort of rise of social media that was never sort of born in captivity that same way. Is that the type of direction where we ought to head, or do you have worries about sort of the government getting involved in that way?
I always have worries about the government getting involved in any way. As I said, I stand firmly on the side of the First Amendment. I don't think we want bureaucrats deciding what is or is not allowed to be spoken on these platforms. While somebody might like the decisions that I would make, in that regard, you might not like what my successor makes or the successor after that. And in any case, that's not what our government is about. Now, that said, I have consistently said, going back to the November speech I referenced, I used Twitter as an example. I said, look, Twitter does have a political viewpoint. It does use that viewpoint to discriminate. And even today, if you look at your Twitter feeds, you're not seeing a chronological list of all the people you follow. They're using algorithms to decide what you follow. Same thing with Google and Facebook and these other companies. They are deciding what you see in some cases in a non-transparent way. That doesn't mean the government should regulate them, but it does mean we should have an open conversation about what the implications are, given that these platforms are so dominant in American society.
So I want to follow up on that and actually maybe take the politics out of it, because the question I'm sort of building up to is, what are the speech rights that these platforms have, right? So if I want to take like a really non-political example, so I'm a dog person. If anyone wants to see photos of my black lab mutt Barney afterwards, I'll gladly show you many of them. But Facebook could decide they're cat people, right? And they want to be a space for cat people. And there are many communities online that sort of, the memes. That have a topic, a viewpoint, an organizing speech by the platform. I think they'd lose a lot of users, a lot of people who like dogs. It's fairly popular. But they could take that position if they wanted to, right? So I guess, one, what are the speech rights of these platforms? And two, what are the appropriate checks on them? You said it's not government, presumably they're market forces and social norms, but how do we actually think about governance in a non-government sense here?
That's a good question. I certainly will say from our part, the FCC does not regulate them. We don't have authority under the laws that have been passed by Congress and the Constitution, of course, under the First Amendment. So from that perspective, they are not going to be regulated in terms of free speech. But what I've consistently said is I would hope that these platforms, especially as they become ever more dominant, would embrace the values of free speech and open debate and be transparent about what they're doing. I don't say that because I sit in a government position, but because I'm an American, and I want everybody, as we move into this more internet-based society, I want everybody to have a fair and full opportunity